Well, thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Hinrich Foundation, I'd like to extend my very sincere gratitude to the Chamber for organizing this very timely and this very interesting event. But let's be honest. The idea of having a discussion about trade policy under the Trump administration is something that most of us would have thought would have been very, very unlikely and perhaps even a bit surreal just 6 months or 8 months ago. And in fact, if you had asked me for my political assessment at that time, I would have told you that I was very, very confident that Hillary Clinton would defeat the Republican nominee, Marco Rubio. So we'll have to, hopefully my analysis of international trade issues proves to be a little bit more accurate than my political prognostications. Let's see. Okay, so here's how I'd like to approach our topic for today. I primarily want to talk about 3 issue areas. Number 1, process and power. What authority does President Trump actually have to implement his trade agenda? Number 2, people and philosophies. Who are the key people in the Trump trade team, and what is their perspective on international trade? And then finally, number 3, I'd like to talk about what some of the most likely potential scenarios are moving forward. Now, what I'm going to do is move very quickly through point number 1 and point number 2 so that we can spend the bulk of our time talking about point number 3, potential scenarios. So, starting off with process and power. As a candidate, and certainly in the early days of his administration, President Trump has made a number of very provocative policy pronouncements about what he'd like to do in the area of international trade. So this raises the very obvious question, well, does he actually have the authority to do some of these things that he is talking about? The short answer is, by and large, yes, he does. Now, the U.S. Constitution actually provides authority to manage international trade to the United States Congress. However, over the years, the Congress has delegated a significant amount of authority back to the President. Now, I could run you through half a dozen different examples. In the interest of time, I won't do that. But I'll just mention one in particular to give you a flavor. And this is Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, which gives the President the authority to take retaliatory action, including tariffs, if he determines that U.S. commercial interests are being damaged by unfair or discriminatory trade practices from foreign countries. Now, if you're sitting there thinking to yourself, well, my goodness, that sounds like extremely broad power, you're 100% correct. It is a very broad power. To date, however, most presidents have been very restrained in their use of Section 301 authority. It remains to be seen, however, whether or not President Trump will likewise be restrained in his use of this authority. But the key takeaway I want you to come away with here is that although President Trump doesn't have unlimited power when it comes to international trade, he does have very substantial power to implement most, if not all, of what he's talked about on his trade agenda. Okay? Let's move along to the second point, which is people and perspectives. I wanted to talk about the 3 individuals who, in my opinion, are the most important individuals on the Trump trade team. And this will be Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Department nominee, Bobwhite, Heiser, the nominated U.S. Trade Representative, and Peter Navarro, the head of the National Trade Council. We could spend a half hour talking about each one. I'll just highlight a couple of points to give you a bit of flavor. Wilbur Ross is a highly accomplished individual and a very successful private equity investor with a lot of experience in China and very clear-cut viewpoints on China. And in fact, if you watched any or all of his Senate confirmation hearings, you will recall that he expressed the viewpoint that China is the most protectionist large country in the world. Okay? He considers himself to be a free trader. He believes in free trade, but he believes that the United States should only open its border to those countries which, quote unquote, play by the rules. Okay? Bob Lighthizer is the nominee for U.S. Trade Representative. In my estimation, in my judgment, Bobwhite Heiser is one of, if not the most well-qualified individuals to ever be nominated to serve in this position. He was Deputy U.S. Trade Representative when I first got my start at USTR back in the late 1980s, and has spent the 25 or 30 years since then as one of Washington, D.C.'s most prominent trade attorneys. This man has an encyclopedia-like knowledge of U.S. trade law. From a philosophical point of view, the one thing I would want to be sure to impress upon you is he feels that the United States has clung to outdated notions, over-idealized notions of free trade, while the rest of the world isn't playing the game by the same set of the rules. And he certainly advocates a much more aggressive stance vis-a-vis China. Finally, we have Peter Navarro, who is the head of the National Trade Council, which is a newly created position in the White House. Peter Navarro is most famous, or depending on your perspective, perhaps you would prefer to say is most infamous, for a book and a subsequent documentary entitled Death by China. Now, as you can probably surmise from that title, it is not a favorable look at China's trade policies, and it goes without saying that Dr. Navarro also advocates a much tougher and a much more aggressive trade stance vis-a-vis China. If I could generalize about these three gentlemen, who clearly will be the core group in the Trump administration on international trade, I would say they are deeply experienced and have very well-developed viewpoints on international trade. None of these people are blank slates. They have very well thought out, long-held positions. Interestingly, though, I would note the only one, although all of them are deeply experienced, Bobwhite Heiser is the only one with government experience. So this is your basic trade team that you're going to be watching, at least at the onset of the Trump administration. Let's move along now and talk about some of the likely scenarios. How is trade policy likely to unfold under President Trump? One of the things that I think is very likely that we can expect to see is a much different approach to trade agreements. The Obama administration and just about all of the administrations over the last 30 years have allowed geostrategic and foreign policy considerations to play a very strong role in their conduct of trade policy. So case in point, of course, is Trans-Pacific Partnership, which if you've ever heard President Obama talk about Trans-Pacific Partnership, it's evident that it is a component of the so-called pivot to Asia. It is seen as a means or a technique to signal to allies and partners in the region that the U.S. intends to stay engaged, and it's a not so subtle message to China that the United States will not lightly cede its influence in the region. So geostrategic considerations under the Obama administration and most administrations for the past 30 years have played a very high role in the conduct of U.S. trade policy. This will change under the Trump administration. This will change. Geostrategic considerations will be significantly downgraded and perhaps even thrown out the window entirely, and trade policy and trade agreements will be conducted on the basis of whether they meet three criteria: whether they increase U.S. growth rates, whether they reduce the U.S. trade deficit, and whether they strengthen the U.S. manufacturing sector. Okay, these are the very clear criteria and the basis upon which the Trump administration is going to approach its negotiation of trade agreements. No more signaling commitment to regions, no more showing partners you're staying engaged. Economics, economics, okay? The other things that you can look for under Trump administration trade agreements will be an attempt to crack down on dumping and an attempt to rein in some of the advantages that state-owned enterprises enjoyed. The other big thing, and you've probably picked up on this if you followed at all the discussion on trade, is that the Trump administration is going to put its emphasis on bilateral negotiations, not the multilateral track and not regional groupings like TPP. Why? Why the emphasis on bilateral agreements? The thinking is that for a large country like the United States, it enjoys a greater degree of leverage in bilateral negotiations than it does with a large group of countries. The other concern is that when you negotiate with a larger group of countries, you can end up with a lowest common denominator approach. Okay? In other words, the ambition level of the agreement cannot exceed the ambition level of the least ambitious member of the grouping. So for those reasons, the Trump administration will clearly be putting an emphasis on bilateral negotiations rather than regional or the multilateral track. Okay, scenario number 2. I think it's very likely that you can expect to see a more aggressive pushback against perceived unfair trade practices. And I want to take a couple minutes and talk you through the specific ways that you can see this manifest itself. I think you're certainly going to see an increase in anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases filed against potentially any trading partner. Now, there is an interesting twist on anti-dumping and countervailing duty that you need to be aware of if you're not already. Wilbur Ross, the Commerce Secretary, has talked about having the Commerce Department self-initiate these cases. Okay? The standard practice has been these cases can only be filed when a company files a complaint. Wilbur Ross is now saying he thinks the Commerce Department should be able to self-initiate these cases. If that is the case, you can certainly expect to see an increased number of anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases being filed. Punitive tariffs, certainly this is one of the more flamboyant statements that candidate Trump and President Trump talked about, slapping tariffs here, slapping tariffs there. As I mentioned, he does have significant authority under Section 301, as well as a variety of other pieces of legislation. So if he wants to do that, in point of fact, he probably can. Whether or not these tariffs will ultimately be determined to be WTO consistent is an entirely different story, but in the first instance, you could see some of these punitive tariffs being applied. The third area where you might very well see some action is on the issue of currency manipulation. Now, if you spend any time whatsoever listening to President Trump's comments on the campaign trail, you undoubtedly have heard him say, China is cheating on trade, they manipulate their currency, and on my first day in office, I am going to declare China a currency manipulator. It sounds very bold, and it sounds very decisive, and it sounds very impactful. The important thing I want you to understand about the currency manipulation designation is that it is largely symbolic. Largely symbolic. There's very limited practical impact, and in fact, the statute that sets up this currency manipulation review only instructs the Treasury Secretary to enter into negotiations if they designate a country to be a currency manipulator. So you might see some action on this. Keep in mind the real practical impact could end up being just symbolic. Now here again, there's an interesting twist on the plot when it comes to currency that you need to be aware of. There is talk that for the first time ever, the Commerce Department might consider currency manipulation as an unfair export subsidy, which they can take action on under countervailing duty laws. This would be a game changer. Okay, this would be an absolute game changer. If we are now saying that currency manipulation is an unfair subsidy and you can take action under countervailing duty, that has teeth. That has teeth because that results in the imposition of tariffs. So keep your eye on that. That is a potential game changer. And the other thing I'll mention is CFIUS, Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. There are already pieces of draft legislation circulating around Capitol Hill which would toughen the enforcement and monitoring of investments moving into the United States. So I just wanted to give you a flavor for some of the particular areas where you might see a more aggressive pushback on international trade. Okay, likely scenario number 3. I am not a gambling man, but if I was a gambling man, this would be the scenario that I would be most likely to bet money on. I think it is extremely likely that you will see a renegotiation of NAFTA. Let me give you a flavor for some of the issues in particular you're most likely to see. Rules of origin, first and foremost. The concern is that, to give you an example, Mexico is able to include too many imported components and inputs from Asia or other regions in products they manufacture and ship to the United States under preferential NAFTA terms. The Trump administration will likely attempt to negotiate a tighter rule of origin, which will clamp down on that. Okay? Government procurement is another area that I think is very likely to come up. Why? What is the issue here? You've heard again and again and again from President Trump. He's made the comment, the bedrock pillar of his administration is going to be buy American, hire American. Buy American, hire American. Well, government procurement provisions in NAFTA, or any trade agreement for that matter, circumscribe the ability of governments to give preferences to domestic suppliers. So in this aspect, the Trump administration will likely be looking to weaken the provisions, to weaken the government procurement provisions so that they have more latitude to implement buy American policies. I think the other area is wages. Wilbur Ross has identified wage levels in Mexico as an issue he'd like to revisit. I think wages and labor issues more broadly, along with the environment, are also likely to come up. The one comment I'd leave you with on this area is I think it is a mistake to view a NAFTA renegotiation as an indication that there is a problem, a dispute, or a trade war. I think this is actually a very healthy exercise. The NAFTA agreement is 23 years old. It makes sense that you would review what works well, what doesn't work well, see if there's things that you can improve or things that you can update. And I think the likelihood is, again, I'm not a gambling man, but if I was, I'd be willing to bet on this. I think the likelihood is that the three countries are able to agree to a very reasonable set of amendments and adjustments that result in an improved NAFTA moving forward. Finally, likely scenario 4, potential volatility in China relationship. Now, I really should have underlined 3 times potential volatility because I don't think it's a foregone conclusion. It's certainly a possibility, but I don't think necessarily a foregone conclusion. A lot depends on China's response, and China might make the decision to respond in a more conciliatory fashion, maybe just with lip service, maybe with deception, but they might make an assessment that it's better to ratchet down tensions and try to take a more accommodative approach where they can. That's one possibility. If not, you certainly could be looking at a cycle of kind of tit-for-tat retaliation. As the US takes action against China, China responds with its own actions. What I want to do is just quickly give you a sense for what tools China will have in its toolbox if it would like to strike back against the United States. What can China do? Well, anti-dumping and countervailing duty is probably issue number 1. The Chinese have learned extremely well from both the United States and the European Union, and they have constructed an anti-dumping and countervailing duty law which is highly effective and capable of inflicting serious damage. If you see a spate of cases being filed by the United States against China, you can expect to see, you potentially could expect to see China filing a number of anti-dumping or countervailing duty cases against the United States. Now, this has not been confirmed, but there is a general understanding that the Chinese government already has an anti-dumping case on soybeans almost ready to go and kind of keeping it in their back pocket if they need something that they want to retaliate with. US soybean exports to China are about $10.5 billion a year, so this would have very significant economic impact. The other tool that China would have to respond would be to use its regulatory regime to tighten the screws on US businesses doing business in China. So you've got the anti-monopoly law, and you can expect to see that being used particularly I think in pharmaceuticals, smart manufacturing, and medical devices. The other thing that the Chinese government can do is use its preponderant influence in the economy through state-owned enterprises or state-influenced enterprises to change purchasing decisions. So you might see a number of very, very, very expensive airplane orders that previously would have gone to Boeing are now going to end up going to Airbus. And then the final item that I draw your attention to, depending on what action the United States takes, the Chinese government very well could be on firm grounds raising dispute settlement cases in the WTO. Of course, each one would have to be decided on its own merits, but that's at least a possibility. Okay, so what I wanted to do was just very, very quickly give you an expedited tour of the horizon for some of the key agenda items that I can expect that we'll see. The one general comment that I leave you with on this entire situation, and that I can say with the most confidence, is this. Trade policy under the Trump administration is going to diverge very sharply from a number of the fundamental principles, not all of the principles, but from a number of the fundamental principles which has guided U.S. trade policy for 30 years. At this point, I think it's entirely premature to speculate on what the results of this new approach to trade under the Trump administration is going to be. But for whatever it's worth, I would suggest keeping your seatbelts fastened because we could be hitting a little bit of turbulence. I'll look forward to continuing the discussion during the Q&A. Thank you very much.